What's up, y'all? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it a magic, and today, the big one. L1 Gigante, the one we've all been waiting for, because after a cruel summer of no standard releases, for 5 months, we finally get to go back to Magic's home plane. It's Dominaria, baby, and Wizards got a lot to live up to with this one. Did they give us the fan service we so rapidly demand, while also giving us them delicious text boxes? Them text boxes we want so bad, want to eat them up like sweet cups. Well, personally, everyone's got their opinion, but I think they did a pretty damn good job. Let's take a look at the top 20 cards in Dominaria United.
And I'm your favorite Magic channel's favorite Magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. You know, I've always wondered, who is that guy rapping in the intro? I don't like him, but what I would like to do is go ahead and get into the list here, because we have got a lot to talk about. You know, it says top 20 cards in the title and the thumbnail and all that, but this is one of my videos. So we're going to talk about 140 cards today. It's might not be that many, but it's probably close. So we got to go ahead and get into it. We got a lot to discuss. I also should tell you, before we really get into it, to like and subscribe. If you haven't done it yet, I have a Twitch you can watch play Magic. You could do Patreon and stuff. The links in the description. I don't know why I'm supposed to tell you all this at the beginning of the video, but I went to YouTube school. It says to do it at the beginning of the video, so do all that stuff. But alright, let's pop it off. Some honorable mentions first, as usual. I don't have a ton of these this time around, and a couple of them are just like things that were too boring to go on the actual list. Like lands, for instance. I never put lands on the list. You guys know that about me by now, but these are some of the most important cards in the set. We got 6 Pain lands. They're important. Thran Portal, that's an important card for 2-color aggro decks, especially the ones that didn't get a Pain land. And then, of course, Plaza of Heroes, kind of been a massive standout in the first few days of the season. All of these lands are great. Also, I have to say, I called Pain lands, along with literally every other person that's ever played Magic, so I don't feel too special about that. But I also want to bring up some removal. Just removal is the second entry in honorable mentions, because there's a lot of these. They're going to matter, right? Things like Temporary Lockdown and Leyline Unbinding have been very good in the opening days of the season. Very good, and will probably continue to form the basis of certain decks. But there's also stuff like Drag to the Bottom, Temporal Firestorm, and of course, Lightning Strike. Like, all these cards are very good, and maybe my favorite, by the way, Tear Asunder. The card's been awesome in the first couple of days of the season. I like that one, but there's just so much uncommon and even rare removal in this set that I think is going to really, really matter. You're going to see it all the time, but still, it's just removal. And then my actual honorable mention, and you'll be happy to know I didn't make this number one. When I first wrote the list, LSL Core was just number one. I was gonna be like, you know, it's my list. I don't care. It's my list, and I love her. So we're getting married. But no, I'll make her the honorable mention, especially after playing with her for a few days, because, you know, she's a 2-mana 2/2. She dies to play with fire. It turns out that happens kind of all the time, like way too much. She dies to cut down. That happens a lot too. So, you know, LSO Core might not be the most powerful thing in the entire world, but I'm still going to play her for the next 2 years, and then I'm going to learn to play like Historic and Modern and Explorer and Pioneer, so I can play her in all those formats. So this one card will probably lead to a large investment for me in the next few years. Good job, Wizards of the Coast. Have my money. LSO Core is my favorite card in the set. That doesn't mean she should be number one, and I've come to terms with that, I think. But let's start the list here at number 20, and we gotta at some point talk about Squee, and I think that we should probably do that to start the list. I'm not sure how great Squee is gonna be, especially with some kind of better options in the 3-drop slot and standard, but I just like that the card's in the set at all. This is the kind of fan service I wanted, but rather than giving us kind of a watered down, like, oh, you can just play Squee whenever you want from your graveyard, but he kind of sucks, they actually gave us like a pretty aggressive, like, good Magic card, which Squee very rarely is. Squee's usually decent for like sacrifice strategies, and if I have enough mana, I'll just play the same Squee over and over in a turn. But no, this guy actually wants to turn sideways, and I respect that. And you know, Squee, the lucky jerk, he got what a lot of us Magic players wanted. He stopped aging in 1998. I still think a lot of us did that too. It's called Arrested Development. But let's move on to number 19 and look at Guardian of New Banalia. This card, I kind of planned for it to be higher up the list, but I have to duck some points from it in a format that has Drag to the Bottom and the Meat Hook Massacre and a couple of other things that can give this minus that are actually fairly highly played. So I don't think this is quite as good of a card as it was last time we saw Seasoned Hallowed Blade. You know, we got Liliana in this format, so you can go Guardian of New Banalia on turn 2 all you want. Your opponent's going to play a turn 3 Liliana, make you sacrifice it. You can discard all the cards you want. you're going to lose your Guardian still. So I don't think we're going to be quite as annoyed by this ability as we were the last time, but I still think it's a solid enough 2-drop to make this list because it's going to show up in tons of aggro decks, especially while the format is still small here, because there's just not a whole lot of like business 2-drops in this format, and I think you just can't do a whole lot better than this right now. So I would expect to see this. Now for number 18, let's take a look at Jaya. RIP to a true gangsta, pour one out and all that stuff, but all story implications aside, Jaya's just a solid Planeswalker. 4-mana walker with 4 abilities, usually pretty good. One of them removes a thing, one of them draws a card, one of them makes a guy. It's literally all this stuff that we want out of a decent Planeswalker, and she also has an ultimate. So I don't know how much play it's going to see, but you could feasibly play her in just about any deck. These Jeskai control decks that want to play like Temporal Firestorm, she's a nice thing to phase out with that card. By the way, did I bring that up in the removal category? I probably should have if I didn't, but either way, Jaya also goes in mid-range decks that just want to play a Planeswalker. And I guess you could even make an argument for her in aggro decks, even though probably better 4-drops, but you know, it's possible. All I'm saying is that Jaya could theoretically go in just about anything and be a decent Planeswalker. So even though I haven't seen too much of her in the first few days of the season, I still gotta say, she's got a lot of potential over the next couple of years she's in the format. Number 17, my spidey sense tells me that Llanowar Green Widow is a pretty good card. Now, it might just kind of look generic, you know. We've looked at a Planeswalker and a Legend so far on this list, so this kind of just looks like a ho-hum normal thing, but I think that this power level is definitely noteworthy, if not for Standard, then even maybe for other formats too, you know? The ability to recur this, and it's already like on curve, you know, 3-mana, 4-power thing, tramples, reaches when you need it to, does die to Lightning Strike, that's fine, because it also then comes back. Just a solid little card here, and I think that Wizards has done a great job in this set of giving us just solid little cards. Even without the Domain Conceit, this is at least a decent creature, but with the Domain Conceit, all it has to do is come back to one time in a game. It probably can, you know, like if you just have like 3 domain, which really just cost a Triome, then suddenly this is not that expensive to get out of your yard. So I like the implications of this, and it probably ends up going in a ton of decks by the end of the day. Guess what I'm saying is the card's got legs. Number 16 is Weatherlight Completed. I have waffled over and over on where exactly to put this card on the list. When I first saw it, I was like, well, that's going in the top 10. And I played with it, and I was like, okay, maybe top 20. We know the Brothers' War is a set that cares about artifacts, so there's probably going to be some decks in Standard that could benefit from a nice, solid 2-drop arty, and this is a great choice in that department. Aside from that, as Standard fills up, the Aristocrats decks will begin to get cards, and this card only stands to receive from that, too. And it already does pretty good work in the Sacrifice decks. Sorry, phone. In the Sacrifice decks in Standard, you know, Oni Cult Anvil, any Elisil core list people are trying to make work, I wouldn't know anything about that. You just throw down your own Meat Hook Massacre, about 7 of your dudes go to the graveyard, you get a bunch of damage because of that, and you instantly animate your Weatherlight Completed and swing over for an additional 5 flying, which just ends games out of nowhere. So it's already decent in Aristocrats list in the Standard, and it's probably just going to get better from here. Speaking of sacrificing creatures, number 15 is Braids. You often see it in the same decks that you see the Weatherlight Completed. You know, the Oni Cult Anvil decks have also, in some cases, added a couple of copies of Braids, because, you know, you've got random, like, token artifacts laying around you can sack. They may not have an artifact, so you just hit them for 2 and draw a card. Or maybe you've got random 1/1 tokens from Anvil laying around. You sack those to Braids and maybe draw a card, maybe make your opponent sack a thing. It all depends on what they choose. But even though this gives your opponent a little too much agency for my liking, this card has still been pretty good in the early days of the format for really forcing weird decisions on them. And combined with a lot of the other cards in the Standard that can chip away at your opponent's life total, there comes a point where they really don't want to not sacrifice a thing. You know, there's a point in the game where they're at 6 or 8, and they would much rather sacrifice a creature than let you draw a card and take 2. So Braids has put opponents in like really weird positions. The fact that this is a 3-drop creature they have to remove actually kind of clears the way for some of your 4 and 5-drop creatures that you'd rather not have removed. So I like that about it. There's just a lot of cool things about Braids on curve. Next up is the Cruelty of Gix. This thing has been an all-star for me and multiple other content creators so far in this season. 5 mana seems like a lot, and there are some really good 5 mana options that aren't named this in Standard, so it is competing for the slots, but it does a lot of work competing for those slots, you know. It almost makes the cut most of the time. So I've liked this card an awful lot so far. And there's a cool line where you use a Cruelty to go get a Cruelty, which gets a Cruelty. I was worried that it didn't affect the board state enough on the first chapter or whatever, but it turns out that in a control or just mid-rangey kind of deck, there are a lot of situations where this is on chapter 1. This is the card that you want, and you can wait the 3 turns for it. But at its worst, a lot of the time, it's just a 5-mana reanimation spell, and some of the times we play those anyway, so you might as well play one that can also get you extra value. It's just been a really solid card so far, and it's probably going to keep being one. Number 13 is another black card, actually 3 in a row, but black's really good in this set, as illustrated by Cult Conscripts. That's right. We went Braids, and then Cruelty of Gix, and then an uncommon. But I actually think this thing is super important. Mono black aggro decks love it because it's Savannah Lions. It's got the 1-mana 2/1 stat line. It's also resilient in those decks. They tend to really like that about it too. But, Aristocrats decks in Standard needed some 1-mana thing to replace Shambling Gas, some other 1-mana dudes that we had that were leaving the format. And I think this is a fantastic replacement. It doesn't give us removal mode or extra mana the way Shambling Gas did and all that. But this is still a great resilient creature that can actually do some damage in the early and late game. It's great sweeper protection. It's pretty good against things like Meathook Massacre and stuff. I know it dies to Meathook easily. Also comes back pretty easily. So that's cool. Again, sacrifice decks both in Standard and Commander are going to love yet another piece like this that you get into these huge loops with. So again, whether it's an aggressive creature that you go this into a 3-power 2-drop and you start beating your opponent's face in, and if they can somehow remove it, you went this into Tenacious Underdog. Your opponent can never actually remove your creatures. Congratulations. So, maybe mono black aggro, but even in the mid-range decks, the Aristocrats decks, all of them are going to love this thing. I had to stop myself from not putting this in the top 10. I'm serious. Because it's got good bones, but while we're showing love to uncommons, let's show love to another. Let's look at Vohar real quick. This might be my favorite uncommon legend in the entire set. Again, this does so much work in a lot of stuff. You can build your janky little I'm going to discard an instant or sorcery and ping my opponent with this, and maybe I play some other stuff that pings my opponent in this color combination. We just win, and it's fun. We've done it on stream already this season. It is very fun and kind of effective, to be honest. So those decks are cool, but, it works in Reanimator decks as well. I think that it could just work in Leer decks and stuff, if you don't have your Leer out. This is kind of a mini Leer for a turn. That's nice. It also allows you to recast counter spells and removal spells and stuff like that out of your yard, and that's just really, really important. If you got nothing else to do and you're looking for cards, just recast a card draw spell out of your yard with your Vona. So, card just looks super solid to me in random mid-range decks, random control decks that might want a creature. There actually are tap-out control decks right now, decks that play flashback cards, decks again that play Leer and Hullbreaker Horror and stuff like that. This plays well with Hullbreaker Horror as well, because if you don't have a card and you're a spell in your hand, you can just get one out of your graveyard and proc Hullbreaker that way. Just a lot of really cool stuff about this, and I know I've already said Reanimator, but I really want to lean into how good this is in Reanimator decks. But anyway, I've wanted Merfolk Looter back for a really long time, so they gave us a ridiculous version of Merfolk Looter, and I'm happy about that. It's on my list. Next up, Kyrion Beastcaller. Kyrion, my wayward son. I just really, really like this, and I've been having a lot of fun experimenting with it in the opening days of the format. There are some feels bads, you don't want to play this into a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Liliana or some other ridiculous 3-drop that isn't a creature. And that can affect not your deck building decisions, but just how you can build your deck. Oh, I can't play these super powerful cards I'd like to play, because I'd really like to cast a creature spell on turn 3, right? So again, this can affect some things, but I think just like the last few cards we've looked at, this has the kind of spread of playability that I really like to see. We didn't see a whole lot of cards that are singularly powerful in a vacuum in a specific deck that are going to rule Standard forever. What we did see in this set are a lot of cards that are powerful for versatile reasons. And I think this is one of those, whether it's in your Selesnya aggro deck or your Gruul aggro deck or your other aggro deck. But this just looks good in just about every deck that actually plays creatures, which it turns out is a ton of decks. It gives me Luminarch Aspirant vibes. If you can play a creature, gets counter every turn, and then when it dies, spreads the love. So it might not be 100% sweeper resistant, but if you have like an indestructible guy or some other dude that survives a sweep, suddenly that thing gets huge when this guy dies. So there's just so many things I like about it. And even though it's proven awkward from time to time in deck building, I still think it's the kind of card that's going to serve as a linchpin for tons and tons of decks in the next couple of years. Number 10 is Shiva Devastator. I love any card with my name in it, but aside from that, again, this card goes in lots of stuff. We've seen Gruul aggro list, Gruul modified list, Boros modified list, Big Red list, Dragons list with Rivaz, who is sadly not on the list, I'm sorry, but just all kinds of stuff that wants to play Shiva Devastator. And this card off the top is maybe the most dangerous card to come off the top of anything in this entire set. The scalability on this thing is just crazy, and honestly, we all talk about like, oh, it comes off the top of your library, it's a 6/6, just wins the game. It can also just be like a 3-mana 2/2, and that's good some of the time, you know? Sometimes it gets a counter from like Kumano faces Kakazan, and it's like actually correctly on curve. Like it's the right power toughness, and that feels good. So I actually really, really like this thing in tons of lists right now. And again, I think this is one of those that in these sort of like creature-based mid-range decks and even certain control decks that just want to win condition off the top, right? They can protect this, swing with it 2 turns in a row and win the game. This is probably going to see tons of play in a lot of different things. But let's move on to Sten for number 9. This is a great example of what I was just talking about, the last 12 cards, right? Just a card that can almost go in everything, you know? It's just begging to be put into an enchantments deck or a planeswalkers deck or an instants and sorceries deck or an artifacts deck or just whatever, you know? He's your Jukai Naturalist and your Mechanaut. He's your Goblin Electromancer. He's everything that you could ever want him to be. Just, I haven't seen too much play from this card so far in the first 3 or 4 days of the season, but that doesn't really mean anything. I think Sten is bound to see a ton of play. Again, whether he's in those Super Friends decks is kind of your only important 2-drop creature, or he's in the sort of, you know, artifact or enchantments decks to help you play your Hallowed Haunting on turn 3 or whatever you're trying to do. Sten could see a ton of play, and I fully expect him to as the days go on. You could even say I expected to see extensive play, but let's move on to number 8. I'm so sorry. Let's move on to number 8. Shale Dread. I didn't think this would be super high up the list. I really didn't. Like, I originally had Shieldy at like number 19, Sholdyhan, the Sholden Girls. Maybe that's it. But I had this card way up the list, but she was still there. It was still on the list, you know. But it turns out, after playing with it and, you know, hearing from the community too, not just playing with it, but hearing everybody else talk about it, the last few days of the beginning of this format, Shale Dread is very good in like mono black aggro decks. This can sometimes be the last few damage that you need to finish off the game because your opponent's already exhausted all their removal on all your early guys. You know, they've tried to kill your Cold Conscripts and your Tenacious Underdog, which, remember, never actually die. So they've used their removal spells on those things. Don't have any removal for She Old Dread. So, She Old Red. It's a Blake Shelton song. Anyway, this has just been like a real standout in the first few days of the season. There's a reason for that. Not just in mono black aggro, but like the mono black control deck that I play against about 30% of the time in the arena. At this point, I plays like Liliana and this and Cut Down and a million other new cards, Meat Hook Massacre too. That deck plays this card, and if you don't have a removal spell for Shieldred, you're basically dead in a few turns. So this card has just been frighteningly powerful in the early days of this format, and I imagine it's going to keep being pretty good. But number 7 is the Soul of Windgrace, another legendary 4-drop, by the way, but this one actually does a thing when it enters the battlefield. So slightly better than Shieldred in my, again, old jaded mind. Not a spike, but old and jaded, yes. One way or the other. I do like this as an ETB trigger that effectively ramps you. I mean, it's like, I've said this before, but it's like a Quandrix Cultivator. With just like way, way better stats. And I like that about it. Cultivator's a playable card. So a 4-mana 5/4 that gets you a land as long as there's one in your yard when an ETB is good. And then if it stays out, it can ramp you even more than that. It can get important lands back from your yard. You can channel lands into your yard and get them back. You can cycle lands into your yard, get them back. You can Field of Ruin and get it back and Field of Ruin again. It's just like so many crazy things this card can do. And in the meantime, it's gaining you life. It's staying alive with that third ability, and it's drawing your cards, cycling lands into your yard, drawing your cards, and then getting those same lands back. If you can actually get like an open stretch of road in front of you with a a Soul of Windgrace on the table, there is a lot you can do with that opening, and I'm pretty much always going to like any cards that mitigate flood in the late game, especially with how much Arena I've played. I've seen some things. You've seen it, Twitch chat. We draw 5 lands in a row at the end of every single game, and Soul of Windgrace makes that a lot better when it does happen, and I like pretty much any card like that. Number 6 is Joda, who I will not call Broda. I promise I will not do that, but this card has also been kind of a surprise in the early days of the format. I think a lot of us thought it was going to be a meme, and then it turns out that you drop Joda, and you have just put 49 power and toughness onto the battlefield, all at one time. Sometimes it's 10 times that. I've already seen a couple of people on Twitch put literally triple digits of power onto the battlefield with a Joda. It gets ridiculous some of the time. So, along with other things, Joda can combine to do some really powerful stuff, but even if he just drops onto the table with a random board full of legends, I swear, if you just drop this onto a table full of legends from legends, like all the vanilla legends, that costs like 8 mana, and they're just like 4 5s, and they don't actually have a text box beyond flavor text. You just drop a Joda onto that board, probably win the game. So, just like Joda has been crazy in the early days, and even though the Cascade is just kind of flavor text some of the time, if you actually do it, because you win the game when you play Joda, but if you actually untap with Joda and play another legend and get the Cascade, that's also very ridiculous. Everything about the card is very stupid, so I don't know why more of us didn't see this one coming, but Joda is definitely powerful enough to be in the top 10. Number 5 is Anointed Peacekeeper. This is another one of those just like generically powerful cards, but I guess we already know how powerful this is. We've had a lead Spellbinder in the format for a while. I was really hoping that card would rotate, but effectively didn't rotate, which kind of sucks, you know? There are subtle differences, and those differences will actually matter a good bit of the time, right? But sometimes the card's actually going to be better than Spellbinder because it can technically hit like multiple cards in your hand, or if you draw into another copy of it, you also have a hard time casting that one, and that's already been really irritating a few times in the standard, but, you know, White had a few solid 3-drops rotating, and it needed a solid 3-drop to come in. It definitely got it. There's just not much to say about Peacekeeper in terms of like, here's a funny joke. Here's a cool line of play with the card. It's just obviously good. And it's obviously going to see all the standard play it ever could desire to see. My thing is that in Historic now you can play Elite Spellbinder and this. So your opponent just never has cards they can cast ever. How annoying is that going to be? But even in Standard, where you can go Thalia into this, and then your opponent just doesn't get to cast their sweepers, it seems pretty good there. Number 4 is the Vim Reels Karn Silex, I mean to say, this card. I know, this is another one that I feel like everyone talked about at the beginning of the season, before the set actually came out, right? And then we got the chance to play with the set. No one's talking about it. That's nuts to me. I have played this card in no less than 5 decks so far, and it's been pretty impressive in every single one of them. Non-land permanent. All of the non-land permanents. It also exiles things. That's just crazy. I do not care that I have to wait a turn. I don't care that my opponent knows it's coming, unless, of course, they have a removal spell for this specifically. But for the most part, this card has been amazing in both the early and mid game for me, and even late in the game, so long as I'm not set to die on the next turn. This card has been a pretty good sweeper. It can't save you immediately, unless you can find a way to untap it. It can't save you immediately, but in the early game and mid game, when people are still setting up, your opponents play like 1, 2, 3 drop, right? Silex can be a great way to get you back on the board, especially in decks that just don't have a whole lot of access to other good sweepers. I've tried this in mono blue, I've tried this in mono red, standouts. I've tried this in mono green, standout. And you're not going to be making a mono green control deck anytime soon, or at least one that works. I'll probably try that, but still, this card is just good for any deck that doesn't have a traditional sweeper, can't play one, whatever. So Standard, Historic, Explorer, Pioneer, Modern perhaps, I'm not sure we go that far, but definitely Commander. This card just ticks the box for a ton of different formats in decks that needed a sweeper pretty much precisely like this. I would have killed to have this in the same format as Forsaken Monument last season, but calm down. It doesn't need to be in the same format as Forsaken Monument. It's a good card one way or the other. But ladies and gentlemen, it is time once again for a coffee break. Now, I did this for the Sleepers video, and a lot of you kind of like this. This is me kind of being able to do just more honorable mentions in a way. These are cards that could have been on the list, but I just didn't know where to put them. I'm not sure they're actually going to be very good and all that. So let's just quickly run through these, starting with a Johnny. Poison Counter Planeswalker, pretty cool, but so far this hasn't been the best card in the world, and his ability the one that's supposed to draw you cards, just kind of read Scry 1. Scry the land to the bottom of your library. It's usually what that card says. But I also like Ratadrabik, or however you're supposed to say his name. Ratadrabik? Maybe. I don't know. But this guy's been cool but clunky so far, the beginning of this season. And I'm not sure that he survives to be anything too special. But, if there's a real Legends deck in the format, like a Joda deck or something, then I think this guy's probably going to at least have a place in that deck. But one way or the other, I've had a lot of fun playing him. But there's plenty of ways to play around him. So, not the best card in the world, but one that I really, really like. There's also Sphinx. Oh, the Sphinx, the domain Sphinx that factor fictions when you hit with it. Again, just in the early days, this has been good. It's been a great sort of finisher for the domain like control decks. There's plenty of ways to get it back if your opponent finds a way to kill it or whatever. So you don't have to play a million copies of it in your deck or whatever. Just a couple is usually all it takes to get an effective swing or two in with this once you've got the game locked down. Sphinx is very good. If you haven't tried this card yet, you should probably try it. This card should actually be on the actual list. It's so good. Same thing with Zur, by the way, the last card in the coffee break section here. Zur is much better than a lot of us expected him to be, but what you're going to do is not necessarily play this on turn 3. You're going to play it on turn 5, right, or turn 6 or whatever, but usually 5 when you have enough mana to drop it and immediately animate an enchantment. And notice, it doesn't animate an enchantment until end of turn. It doesn't animate the enchantment until Zur dies. It just animates the enchantment forever. This card has been great with like Leyline of Binding, because you get Domain, you cast the Leyline for like 1 mana on their best thing, and then you turn it into a 6/6 lifelink hexproof. It's just... whew, Zur has been a beast in the early game, in the early goings of this format. And at first I was thinking, going to be a really great commander. We're going to get a good commander deck out of this one, aren't we? You're going to put it on the channel. It's going to be fun. But no, I think this is like a real player in Standard. And I'm not even kidding. But let's move on to the top 3 here. Number 3, we'll start with the 2 mana anthems and we'll just call them that. You pick your favorite one. I like the Soldiers one in Standard because I don't know if you knew this, but there's actually like a ridiculous amount of playable soldiers in Standard. Like even with just a small set, Standard, we only have 5 sets in Standard, still tons of good soldiers. So check that out if you haven't yet. Go to Scryfall, Soldiers, Future Standard, search with these options. You'll see more than you thought there were, but aside from that, they get a little better from there. The red one, the Goblins one, looks pretty good, especially for formats that actually have Goblins decks. Standard isn't one of them. The Elves one looks great, especially for formats that actually have Elves decks. Actually, the Elves one looks just completely righteous. I just draw all the cards in the world whenever. Okay, thanks, I'll do that. And an Anthem, thanks. Why did you print this card? It just looks ludicrous. The Cleric's one is not great, but it's another one that I have hope for in Standard because it doesn't say go search up a Cleric. It goes tutor for anything, which is subtly very good, I think. So I've got my eye on it. Aside from that, though, the blue one. The blue one, I think, is the best for lots of reasons, right? The Merfolk decks in older formats will really, really like this thing, but it's just kind of good by itself. It's just, even if you don't control any other Merfolk whatsoever, it's still a 2 mana 1/1 flash that you can sacrifice to like Jwari Disruption your opponent, or Syncopate for 1, Power Sync for 1, whatever your old school force your opponent to pay mana counterspell of your choice. And that's just really not bad by itself in like mono blue tempo decks where it's an annoying threat that flashes in and can deal a few points of damage before it keeps your opponent off the sweeper. It's just so good. It really is. In a lot of situations. So I think it's just generically powerful even outside of tribal decks. But in tribal decks, it obviously fins games. They were nice. Number 2 is a card whose original printing used to haunt my nightmares back in the late 90s, and that is Ertai. Now, honestly, the thing about Ertai back in the day is that it would sit on the table and taunt you like a jerk with that stupid smile on his face. He'll try to play a spell. You can't play a spell. You can never play a good spell again. And I know when you're trying to bait me. You can have the bad stuff. You'll never have the good stuff. I have 4 mana up every turn. I hate you, Ertai. I hate you, Ertai, so much. But this Ertai, now I have to worry. Now I have to be like, is Ertai here? I can't see him. Is Ertai here? So it's going to give me, a lot of stress, and I'm a heart patient for the next couple of years while this card is in Standard. If I can't beat him, join him. I imagine the best advice I can give you is to play this card. Interacting with the stack or the board state at instant speed And it's got a body, like, jeez. Very irritating card, and it was almost my number one, but I had to make room for the queen. Number one is Liliana of the Veil. Now, a lot of the times, reprints are not number one, and there's a reason for that, right? A lot of times, the best cards in the set are the cards that are going to impact the most format. Like some number ones are number ones because they affect Commander and older formats and newer formats and everything in between. Liliana is not necessarily one of that, but I still think we need to acknowledge exactly how powerful this card is and exactly how much it brings to formats it wasn't in, like Pioneer, Explorer, Historic. The list goes on. Actually, it doesn't. I think that's basically the big ones. I think Liliana on 3 is something we're going to have to take into account for the next 2 years at this point. So it's very likely that we get very sick of that, but that's because Liliana is a good card, and I'm probably not shedding any new light in the situation or teaching you anything you didn't already know. Liliana is ridiculous. This card's in standard now. We didn't think they'd do it. We thought they were a bunch of wusses. Wizards of the Coast, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. Come on, man. And here we are. I'm impressed. They did it. Here she is. But anyway, y'all, that is the top 20, really like 27. Really, if you count the fact that it lands and removal, it's kind of the top 50 cards. Dominaria United. There were a lot of things to talk about today. I know a lot of people aren't like super high on this set, and I don't get that. Again, I think the fan service is on point. The uncommons are ridiculously good. I always like when I see that in a set. I'm a budget player. Aside from that, like, there's nothing too outrageously powerful, and there's a lot of really exciting build-arounds. There's tons of nostalgia, characters that have never gotten cards before. What do you want out of a set, is all I'm saying. I think that they didn't necessarily hit the nail on the head, but they got at least 3/4 of that nail directly on the top. So I really have liked what I've seen from this set. I've liked playing with it. I liked experiencing, like, the journey of spoiler season and all that. And I think that the set will continue to be an important player all throughout its, life term in standard. Aside from that, watch me play some Magic on twitch.tv/SBMTGdev, link in the description, or throw me $1 a month on Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG, or again, you can link to that in the description, or you can just put it into your address bar. That's all you got to do. Patreon.com/SBMTG, $1 a month, and you can vote on what decks and other content we do this season. Pretty good deal. But that's all the pitching I got to do. I'm pretty bad at it, and I hate doing it, so I don't want to do it for too long. I guess I'm done for this one, so I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.